All right, welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. There's some others coming, but we'll give them the prayer to get situated. Let's see. So let's go ahead and just get started immediately with our opening word of prayer. And we'll go ahead and say the Lord's Prayer again together to open the class. So, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, good morning, and welcome back to the Lord's Prayer class. I'm always really happy to see you all here, so I just want to thank you again for your time and presence here, for being part of the conversation. Today, this is our fifth class together this spring, and we're going to be discussing the phrase in the prayer, hallowed be thy name. So that's our focus for today. Up till now, we did our intro classes, which I'll stop totally reviewing at this point every time we start class. But just, kind of do it the first couple weeks to get us going and get us aware of sort of what we're doing. So if you missed those, I'd encourage you to go back to the first one or two. We have them recorded. But what we did is just an intro in 2 weeks or so, including an intro to the Sermon on the Mount. And then we're spending the rest of the class doing the prayer itself, the Lord's Prayer, phrase by phrase, as it occurs in our prayer book, which is actually a little bit different than it occurs in either Matthew or Luke. So we're sort of aware of Matthew and Luke here in the background, but because the version in the prayer book is what we encounter in our life together here, that's the one that we're working from primarily. Because I want us to be interrogating the details of those phrases and how those words string together for us. Hey, Bill, would you mind grabbing the door and closing it? Sorry, it swung open again. Thanks. Thanks so much. We've done Our Father, and then last week we did Who Art in Heaven. So that got us through the address of the prayer, or the invocation, rather. And now this week, we're looking at Hallowed Be Thy Name. And it may come as a surprise to you to learn, a lot may come as a surprise about this phrase, because it's it's kind of an odd phrase, honestly. Everything about it is pretty ambiguous for the average listener to modern English, at least. It just a lot about it doesn't hit home. But the first thing to notice about it is that this is the first petition in the prayer. So if we have Our Father who art in heaven, that's, if you're writing a letter, that's the part that comes before the comma, right? And then now we're getting into it. Now we're getting into saying the prayer. And the first thing that is asked of Our Father who art in heaven in the Lord's Prayer is, or asked or petitioned rather before this God, is hallowed be thy name. It's quite an odd petition, and it's not any less odd in Greek than it is in English. It's a really complicated verb form, in fact, this word hallowed, to be made holy or something. So I don't know if you know Greek, but this is an aorist verb, is the tense. But for anybody who's aware, for those who don't do Greek at all, it's a sort of like a past, what is it? Like a past progressive perfect, or I don't know. But it's basically, hallowed be thy name means something like, may it have been hallowed by now in the past. So like, may it have been done that it is the case now. So you're invoking something that you're hoping has happened or is happening progressively, that is therefore the case at the present moment, right? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, okay. So it's like, may your name have been made holy, or rather, may your name have been made holy, but continue to be made holy. So it does matter that this is something that has happened, but it's also trying to say, let this happen now. Like, may it be made holy. So that's the tense, and we'll come back to that, of what we're saying, because I think it matters. If we're going to say, hallowed be thy name every week, we should know what the heck we're saying. But that's sort of the very literal wooden is like, may your name be made, may your name have been and continue being made holy. But what the heck does it mean for the name to continue or have been made holy? What does holy mean? But certainly, what does it mean for something to be made holy? Yeah.
Does it equally translate as holy be your name?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, the word hallowed that's exactly what it means. It can even be translated something like consecrated or sanctified. These words are all part of the same sort of family, at least in theological language. Not exactly etymologically the same, but like consecrated is a really good one. It's much easier in Hebrew and English, Hebrew and Greek, because there's actually these verbs that mean like just to make something holy, and we just don't have a verb, like as in that took me like 4 words to say, but in Greek and Hebrew there's actually a verb that just means to make holy, and we might say consecrate, that's literally what it means, to make something holy or separate. But that's kind of what this means, is to holyize something. Or to sacredize it or something. Sanctify has this kind of aspect of cleansing or making clean or pure that's not really there in the ancient, like the dimensions of this word holy. It's very close, theologically, but the actual the work that this word is doing is more like to make it separate or different. And sanctification has its own big, long doctrine about, especially with people and the cleansing of, so it's a little different. But this is why I think we could say, may it be consecrated or something, but not quite may it be sanctified. I don't know. But holy, hallowed, same-ish sort of deal. But that said, this question is quite difficult and weird to answer, I think. What does it mean for the name to be hallowed or to be made holy? And actually, before I move into it, I'll just open it up. What does this mean to y'all? What have you heard when you say, hallowed be thy name? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Sets the tone.
Okay, so...
It sets the tone, like, sacred and holy. I've never thought of it as actually a prayer, part of the prayer. Like,
right.
This is the way it is. Your name is holy. Okay.
So hallowed is thy name, or something like that, right?
Right. I've never saw it as a petition.
Right. So that's a great point. And it.
But that's why,
Mm-hmm.
I'm lack of imagination.
No, it's not. Yeah. So it's that's another way that it's been translated, in fact, and reproduced is like, your name is holy, essentially. And different recensions of the prayer present it that way, literally. I think that there's a long tradition of saying sort of hallowed or blessed be something in a lot of Jewish prayer. So I think that we have a good reason to think that it's not only this kind of statement about the present reality, but actually kind of an invocation of something that should be done over and over again, like blessed be the name, like may it be blessed. But I think what you're saying is part of it, and like we should just kind of expand it. So that's totally a valid like dimension of how we can read this and hear it, just to be clear. I see a lot of hands. Who should I go with first? I saw one back there. Was it you? Or did you have your hand? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's somewhat, I was trying to say a second ago, is a little bit different than sanctify. But yeah, just there's a separateness or a distance to this thing. That's just the basic meaning of being holy. Others, responses to like what it means to them or how you hear it? Yeah.
would think there would be implications for how you're going to use the name in speech. I mean, you're sort of invoking it in the prayer.
Right.
To keep it holy, you're going to be careful how you use the name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm remembering when I discovered years ago that, not taking the Lord's name in vain doesn't mean swearing.
Yeah.
That it means using it superficially or using it to prop up your own ego or for your own ends. That was just something
Right.
I picked up years ago.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's correct or not, I don't know. But,
Right.
yeah, it seems to me there are implications about how you're going to use this name.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't names really powerful in the ancient world? I mean, names had power beyond just representing something in the physical world.
Yeah,
More so than today.
I think we could maybe say that. I also think often the difference is when we say that things were different, at least this is my opinion, based on more than, I guess, opinion. But I think that a trend in sort of modern treatments of the ancient world is to notice these differences in the way you just stated it. So like things were, like a name was more powerful back then, or that it's not today or something. I actually think it's like often the case that we're quite similar. It's just that we like have blind spots in our ancient or modern cultures. So today, for instance, we don't think names are that powerful. In fact, they really are. We just kind of don't like consciously acknowledge that about our culture. Whereas maybe in the ancient world, it was like more kind of explicitly appreciated, or maybe not. But I think that there are ways that we try to sort of feel like we're missing out on something that was present in the ancient world that's not now. But I think they were quite like us and quite vain and trivial about names, while also at moments of conscious piety or whatever, appreciating the dimensions of what a name can hold. So I think we're like a lot more similar than we think to ancient people. It just has to do with more like the effort you're making in a given moment to try to appreciate something, And ancient people, just as well as us, like didn't do that all the time. So, but I think you're onto it about how we use it and how like basically how and when do you invoke the name. And there was a sensitivity that certainly, especially like postmoderns, don't have about what it means to invoke a divine name. So to your point, I do think you're right that like in a cultural setting where the reality and activity of the divine is presumed as like a starting point for serious intellectual activity, whereas in our context, it's the opposite. It's like to start with serious humanistic intellectual activity, you take for granted that there is no active divine force. Everything comes down to other stuff. And so we kind of don't take for granted the reality of the divine. So you have to work yourself up to taking divine names seriously in our culture, whereas you'd have to work yourself down from it in the ancient world. But I think both can be done. So it just matters what community you're participating in and how they're cultivating your sensibilities about these things in either the ancient or the modern world. Yeah.
We really don't say his name. Our Father, except our Father, hallowed be thy name.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just make it just like a Jewish approach.
Yeah.
The not saying the name.
Yeah, you're right. We don't really use God's name very much. Yeah.
Said our Father, who are Yahweh, who are God, hallowed be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get to that because we're going to read Exodus here in a second. A good old New Testament class with Evan. So actually, we'll put a pin in that point and we'll encounter it here in the text in just a second head on. But thanks for bringing it up because you're right, we don't use the name. So what name are we talking about and who cares, right? Other hands? Yeah, sure.
I think it also, from calling the question, who can do the hallowing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
It's something that we have agency down here to do.
Yeah, and how? What does it mean?
and how.
Who cares? Yeah, what is it? Like, And I'm not sure I can answer all these things today, for the record. When I set up these questions, I often create expectations, and people are like, dude, you never came back around. I really should stop. But these are the questions I think that are provoked by this prayer. I honestly think at minimum we should be aware of the kinds of questions that are produced by the things we say in our prayers, if not being able to say something about the answers to those questions. But at minimum, I think good theology, we have to be able to say, okay, well, this is asking this, because that question is kind of where our growth and life of faith takes place together. It's living in those spaces. What does it mean to make God's name holy, or that our group is doing that, or claiming to do that? These are great responses. Thank you for your sort of candid and just off the cuff responses to the phrase. Like I said, to get into this New Testament conversation, we're going to turn to Exodus. So the first thing we're going to do is Exodus 3. That's page 85 of your Oxford Bibles, if you have them. Anybody need a Bible that doesn't have one? There's several sitting around in here. No? Okay, great. There's two at least up here if anybody needs one. So we're going to read Exodus 3. There's a couple of things I want us to think about as we hear this text. A couple of things besides the phrase, hallowed be thy name, obviously. But just a few sort of key questions I want to be on the table about this idea of God's holiness on the one hand and God's name on the other, and how they're connected and what that means for us as a people. Actually, coming off that sentence, here's the first key question, because I even feel kind of theologically stuffy when I say all these words, like the sentence I just said about holiness and names. And honestly, this is just keeping us grounded in public theology and what it means to be Christians in 2020, and in a cultural context that doesn't talk about holiness and Yahweh and whatever else we're going to encounter in Exodus 3. I honestly struggle, especially with this idea of holiness. Personally, as a theologian, at least a young, aspiring theologian, one of the questions that really stumps me, or that I'm troubled by in 2020, looking ahead to hopefully a career as teaching people in theology, is this question: how do we, as the church in 2020, recover a strong sense, or how about a positive sense, of God's holiness and God's goodness? And how do we get to a place where that can sound like good news to us as people? Because, go with me here, and if it's just me, fine. But I think this has been sort of mostly bad news in, I think, this sort of subconscious, at least, of the Western church, and probably the American church. And what I mean by that is, often the fact that God is holy, or God is good, or God is separate, or whatever, is sort of the premise for moving into a narrative about humans and people and salvation or whatever that moves immediately to how much we suck, right? So you go from God's holiness to human unholiness, God's goodness to human whatever's not that. And the narrative is built often on this kind of emotional swing from, look how great God is and holy God is, it's so beautiful and good, and look at the muck that is humanity. And that's true. Theologically, that's sound. Things like the doctrine of the incarnation are literally exciting because of that point. So I don't mean to say that that's not necessarily true. There's nothing to it, but I do wonder in 2020, seriously, how do we get around to thinking that God being holy is exciting or empowering news? How would we allow the claim that God is holy? How can we get to a place where that becomes something that we could actually say about the reasons that we are Christians, or that we participate in the life of the church? In my experience, saying that because God is holy, or because holiness is essential to God's character, is not a great way to start conversation, about faith or about the reasons that you go to church or whatever. And I don't mean to make this sound like evangelistic. That's not what I mean. I mean like when how does our faith intersect with life, in this culture, in this place? Because that's what we're a part of, right? And I just feel like this idea in particular is often the one that gets most insulated and kept away from public discourse about faith. There's a lot of things in Christianity that I think we find it a little easier to talk about when we interface with culture. But one of them is the fact that God is holy and good and separate. I just don't think that. I think that's one that we talk about that when we're together as a church, in the church, and we're all on the same team, and we get it, and it's not making anybody feel bad necessarily. But I just wonder if there's a better way to articulate this reality than it has been for the last several generations in the Western church. So,
Evan, are you saying you want God's holiness to make us feel better instead of making us feel worse?
I think it should be good news, certainly. I think we should be glad that God is holy. And often, I think in the Western church, God's holiness is scary. And look, it's scary. That's orthodox. We should be scared of God in some ways, but we shouldn't be only scared of God, and we shouldn't be totally scared of God. And we shouldn't be scared of God in the sense that we can't trust God. We should be scared in the sense that God is great, and we should be aware of that. But I think there's a lot of the Western church that is fearful of God's holiness in the sense that it makes God not on the same team as us, and we can't quite trust it, and it makes us feel bad about who we are. And that guilt and shame, I don't think that's the purpose of God's being holy. Is to make the creation, feel like something far from God or different from God. I think there's something exciting, or there should be a gospel to God's holiness. There certainly is in Exodus. That's what happens here in Exodus 3 and 4. So I'm just wondering how, when we make this claim, when we petition that God's name be recognized as holy, how can we get behind that, in a public way, and find it to be something that we like about our identity as Christians? Yeah, Paul.
You can attempt to, whatever evangelicals will allow you to sort of rehabilitate image.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of God as too punitive. And,
Right.
a lot of what you're saying brings to mind the original sin doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
how there are all kinds of little twists of that, but essentially one of the little twists was that we can't do anything good of our own accord without
Right.
God's involvement.
Yeah, right.
Without God's involvement, we're just...
Yeah.
So there's a thread of that in our traditions, and
Yeah.
the church has interpreted the story, but there are other interpretations as well.
Yeah.
And
Right.
yeah, I mean, for me, everybody's to come to their own decisions about these things, but I can't square a punitive God with the God who hates violence and is also so forgiving that God allows a part of God's self to die
Mm-hmm.
a brutal death rather than retaliate. So,
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think God is non-punitive, but that's kind of a universalist in that respect.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I'll say one more thing, and then we'll get to the reading. But I think just to sum up my question, it would be just how, let's say holiness hasn't been, or God's differentness or otherness or goodness hasn't been, used to batter you personally in your life of faith, which is perfectly, not everybody has the same experiences of it. I'm just trying to draw sort of what I think is a general trend, an observation about a trend towards seeing God's moral otherness or holiness or perfection rather as something that makes God distant in a frightening way or in a troubling way. Granted, whatever you think of that or however you've experienced it, the question is still open for us, I think. I want us to think about how we can get behind this petition, to make God's name holy, and why we should be glad, or what in that is good news for us when we're praying for it. Because we pray for it every week together, and it's supposed to form us as a community, that we want God's name to be made holy. So I just want us thinking, why do we want that? And what's in it for the community of faith? What's in it for God? And what's in it for the relationship between those two things to pray this? So hold other questions and comments for now, if you will. And we'll read Exodus, and then we'll keep talking about this a little bit. So Exodus 3:1, that's on page 85 of these Bibles. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it so that y'all can just listen and see what you hear. Okay, so 3:1. So Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. We'll stop there. I'm going to open it to discussion in just a minute, but before that, I'm going to give you a few sort of, guiding reflections or prompts following this reading about what we just heard. So, first, just to come back to our basic questions, we're thinking here about, what does it matter that God is holy? What does it mean that God is holy, or that holiness is a part of who God is? What does it matter that God has a name? Does it matter to us that God has a name, or that God is nameable rather than unnameable? We don't believe that God is an unnameable entity. We believe God has a name. That's part of our scriptural tradition. We believe that God is obviously able to be manifest in many ways, but we do believe in a God who has revealed that God's self as a nameable person, if you will, a relatable person, one with whom we can have relationship. through this name. And as we said a minute ago, this is part of our prayer as a Christian people. We want this name, God's name, to be made or kept holy by our life together and through our life together. So with that said, here's just a few kind of basic reflections about this text that I'd love your thoughts on and your reflections to, especially with regard to the Lord's Prayer that we're looking at. In this text, where we see Moses and God encountering each other for the first time, the whole encounter is characterized by an ongoing dialogue. So dialogue and conversation they are the essence of how this encounter works. It's not a single command and an action that follows from Moses. It's not God doing something with Moses. We could easily narrate that God plucked up Moses and made Moses do X and Y on God's behalf to get the Israelites out of Egypt. No, this encounter, which continues, by the way, another quite a ways, up to like chapter 7 or so, this encounter is dialogue, two voices, right, working together. In fact, it's not just any kind of dialogue, it's a real dialogue. It involves a lot of objections and arguing about what's going to happen here. In fact, 8 objections by Moses occur in this whole conversation. We didn't get to all of them, we got to 1 or 2. But Moses objects fully to what God is saying 8 different times. And each time God has a response. And to be clear, God's responses are not because I said so. God's responses are thoughtful engagements with Moses's last or most recent objection. God argues or haggles with Moses over how this is going to play out. So at each turn, there's an objection from Moses, and God considers that and comes back at Moses with a different deal, or a different response, or whatever. But the point is that these two are very legitimately haggling it out. So, what I want to point to first of all about this text, if we're putting holiness and the name kind of on the back burner for a second, we'll get there, but is that the dialogue itself is very theologically significant for what this text, a very important text in the Torah and in the whole of Scripture, is trying to say to the community of God about God's character. The dialogue itself is theologically significant. The recognition of holiness by Moses, or by the reader, for instance, the revelation of holiness about God does not lead to passivity in the presence of God. That's very important, that when God says, I'm holy, the response isn't, oh, I'll back away, right? I'll stop. I'll freeze up. I'm done here. It's your turn because you're holy. And that means you're in charge and I'm out of the equation. No, in fact, it's quite different than that. Instead of passivity, the divine holiness is apparently of such a character that it invites rather than repels human response, right? It's inviting to human engagement. It invites genuine conversation. I think this is something we don't appreciate enough about Moses here, that you have to remember these texts, they're not, we've talked about this quite a bit before, but just to put it in short, these texts are not literal what the camera would have caught history, about what might have happened actually by this rock somewhere. These are artful presentations that matter for the identity of whole people groups. When you construct a story like that, you do it carefully. And when you preserve and transmit a story like that over time, it must mean that this story in all its pieces, means a great deal for major ideas that hold our identity together. So we're looking at this as a painting, not as a documentary, but as a beautiful portrait of God and God's great prophet, the first called of Israel in Exodus, how they encounter each other. And the first thing we see is God's holiness, not frightening someone away, but drawing someone in, and not just drawing them in, but drawing their feedback, literally, their objections to God's ideas and God's thoughts. God's holiness, God's otherness, invites Moses' genuine engagement with God. Moses' genuine concerns are voiced in immediate response to God. And notice they're not solicited. Moses just gives them, right? God doesn't say, by the way, like, any thoughts? Moses just comes out with it because apparently something about this holiness is affecting that very dynamic. This is very important. Moses is often cast here as like not getting it, or like not really faithful or whatever. He's kind of doubtful. We can all relate to that, right? Like Moses isn't a flawed sort of response to God. Moses is the ideal response to God, I think, in this tradition. Moses is not a sub-class of how one might come before God. Rather, Moses is the prototypical, of Israel, the one who first encounters and models encounter and dialogue with this God. And we see this throughout the Torah from Moses, but it's important to understand this isn't just a funny moment, for somebody with a speech impediment. This is a picture of God, beginning God's relationship with this people. And it looks like conversation. It looks like dialogue. And holiness, the idea of holiness, is explicitly at the center of this scene. And on that note, what I was just saying, furthermore, it is not just a human who challenges God, right? But an inarticulate one. And he holds his own before God. It's actually Moses' persistence that occasions a greater fullness in God's own revelation of God's self. Without this persistence, we don't get the further revelation that comes in chapter 3. In fact, the revelation of the name is a result of Moses asking questions. We don't just get a monologue from God that includes all this information. The very fact that the people of God have the name of God in their tradition is the result of a person fumbling questions of concern and pressing God for more information about God's self. That's really theologically significant, that we don't just get God's opening speech to Israel. We get a dialogue where Moses is pushing and nudging and notifying God about what information might also be useful if we're really going to get into relationship here.
Why did you call Moses inarticulate?
Sorry, what?
Why did you call Moses inarticulate?
Well, he really is, and he says so, yeah. So later on in this story, he's very concerned about his inability to speak, as are a few other prophets, actually. But he... not only that, but if he hadn't said that about himself, there's quite a few stories in the Torah that make it clear he's not very good at communicating. So just in general, this is not the model, of a sort of CEO of Israel that, just has all the charisma and ability to speak and all that. And so what I'm saying is that it's not just a human who gets God to give more information. It's a fumbling, inarticulate one. And this is the picture of the beginning of Israel's peoplehood. In other words, it doesn't take rhetorical performance, of a perfect quality to get God to argue back. It doesn't take that much effort. God is open to this kind of conversation, and Moses' inarticulate fumbling is enough to get God's own name, out of God's self. So, just trying to emphasize the weakness of the first attempt at pushing back at God, from Moses here. Just a couple more points before I open it up to conversation, but just continuing with what I was saying, God reveals God's self in this text, not simply at God's own initiative, right? But rather in interaction with a questioning, created being. That's where God's fullest revelation comes to fruition. In fact, from another perspective, one could say that this story witnesses to God's initial lack of success in persuading Moses to take up his call. God makes God's best efforts to persuade Moses in this story, and Moses remains unconvinced. Truly, God's ideas about what's going to happen next are apparently not comforting or convincing enough for Moses to be on board. This is an important part of our picture of God at the start of Israel's story. That, I mean, we can claim, as a people, God is not always very convincing when God calls peoples or groups or communities into things. And that's part of what makes God a God that we need to be in relationship with and we need to be arguing with, is that this God is not just sort of an oracle of perfectly communicated commission or whatever. Often the experience of call or the experience of work with God in the world can look like needing to press God into a better version of what God had in mind. And I think this goes against a lot of what's passed to us about God in church or whatever. We hear a lot about God just having great ideas and perfect ideas, and we kind of need to figure out what they are. Exodus 3 and 4, quite a different picture. God has ideas, Moses has ideas too, and by the end of this story, what we come out with is something quite different than either of them came to the table with. So there's a synergy going on that produces what actually happens and affects the most important story in the whole Bible, if I may call it that. Really, the story comes out of a shared agency, between these two. And that was going to be my next point. It's just that ultimately God then, through this arguing, has to accept a version, of the plans that Moses is also willing to accept, right? So that's a condition on which God gets to move forward on God's plans for Israel. Is that God has to get to a place where they've come up with something that works for everybody. and so it's not that Moses gets to have whatever Moses wants. It's that they both have to sort of come a certain amount of distance to meet each other in a place where they can work together to make a plan. And the one they come up with involves Aaron. That's not what God had in mind. Aaron's going to be the spokesperson. So God's way into the future then is not dictated solely by God's word and will. That's kind of my point. Rather, God places the divine venture into the hands of another. God will have to work through both Moses' strengths and weaknesses, right? God is going to work with this person because of the whole picture of who this person is. And in fact, it's because of who this person is that the story is going to take a lot longer than God would like it to. There's going to be a lot of bumps along the way that look a lot more like Moses than they do like God. And God doesn't prevent that from happening because God is so committed to this being a relational effort. So God will then, as a concluding point, I guess, God will have to accept about Moses and Israel that God will not be in total control of the ensuing events. When I phrase it that way, does that worry anybody? I think that's what we see here, is that, this scene is the revelation of God's holiness to the greatest prophet of Israel's history, the one that will lead them out of Egypt. And here is God doing what? Relinquishing degrees of control, right, to this person, working with them to move toward a different draft of the plan. And coming out on the other end with one that sounds less clear and straightforward than the one God presented in the first verses we read today. And to negative effects. Like, things don't go as well because things don't go the way God had in mind. So yeah, God had a great plan, but God went with the plan that involved working with Moses, not the one that involved severing Moses from the plan. Though God gets close to doing that a couple times throughout the story. Anyway, so what is what I've been saying opened up for you, or how would you respond to it, or and you can think about holiness or the name. We'll get there by the end of today more explicitly, but just for now, looking at this story and the kind of God we see in it, that this God is holy. That holiness is the kind of presence Moses is drawn into here, but this is the sort of thing that unfolds out of it. What does this open up for you? Yeah, go ahead. Noah.
So I had some questions about where Moses is coming from and his familiarity. When he asks for asking the name,
Yeah.
Which God are you? Because he would have been familiar with Egyptian gods and probably other gods, or is it more introductory as far as oh, sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Right.
I guess I'm trying to understand all the things he would ask. Of what importance is that?
Yeah. It's a great question. Let's see. I wanted to, in response to that, read somebody else's words and not mine. Is that all right? Because actually, that question was on the table for me too, and this is Terence Fretheim. By the way, if you're interested in the book, I can show you later. It's just his little commentary on Exodus. But here's what Terence Fretheim has to say about verse 13 and following. Here's his introductory remarks about it, and that's what we're talking about. But Moses said to God, "Well, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'Well, what is his name?' what shall I say to them?" Right? So the question is, who are you? Like, what's your name? And what am I going to tell them when they ask me that? Apparently this is of some concern. So Fretheim says, Moses continues the conversation with a question. That's verse 13. His "who am I" becomes "who are you?" Yet it is not a question of suspicion or hostility. It is a question that is open to the future. That is, if I come to the Israelites. Human openness, is met by divine openness. The question draws forth God's name from God, God's self. Moses' asking leads to insight. And here's the sort of important point. Human questioning leads to fuller divine revelation. God thus reveals, not simply at the divine initiative, but in interaction with a questioning human party, God's approach to Moses invites such questions. In this way, what God reveals is related to what Moses believes he needs to know in order to do what he is called to do. God's revelation is thereby tied directly to the human situation. Both God and Moses recognize that God is not demystified through further understanding. In fact, the more one understands God, the more mysterious God becomes. God is the supreme exemplification of the old adage, the more you know, the more you know you don't know. So I think one of the points here is Moses, for whatever reason Moses needs the name, it's apparently a currency really important to human beings getting mixed up in this process. I need to know more about who you are. And name is a part of how humans do that. It's a way of moving toward a more vulnerable space, in relationship. And I think that what what Moses is doing here is asking, I need to give them, we're going to need some more exposure, here from you. And there may be a sense here about, there certainly is in the larger narrative of the Pentateuch, there's a sense of identifying that this God is the same God as the ancestors. That's a very important sort of literary element at play here for the reader of the narrative as a whole. And that's emphasized throughout this text. I am the God of Jacob and Isaac. But I am who I am doesn't quite deal with that, right? That, in fact, is a name that's more open to what's going to happen, what's ahead. I am who I will be, rather, or I will be who I will be. That opens the narrative to the question of, it's a name, it's sort of an empty linguistic sign, though. It's just, here's my name, but watch me fill it, right? And that's what the ask is. So I'll give you a name, but now we're going to fill it up with ways of describing what that name means, and that's what the rest of the story does. But I think the name itself as currency is the first move toward God making, Moses demanding that God make God's self vulnerable to the people of Israel in a way that God wasn't necessarily planning on, but through relationship and, inviting Moses' opinion and argument, finds out that God's going to need to do in order to successfully work together with this people and to sort of bind with them and earn their trust. So that's one thing I would say, is just that it's interesting to me, very important to me theologically, that God is, I think, surprised, by the request for a name and has to come up with an answer. And that the answer we get, this tradition, the name Yahweh, is not appreciated as such very often as the answer to a question that was once asked by a person, or rather by a people represented by this person. That's some of what I'd say to the name question, or why Moses wants it. Others? Yeah.
Well, I'm playing myself into this, and I know it. But when I
Yeah.
say, God is holy,
Mm-hmm.
then the next thing that I go to is, so why is it so bad here? Sort of.
Mm.
And so it makes me think about, I think God is and what God can do. And this story, when it comes out, he says, I've seen the trouble here.
Mm.
And I want to say, well, it's about time. Because
Right.
this didn't just happen yesterday.
Yeah, right.
And so then, though, as it goes through this first part that we read, for me, the most important thing, I'll be with you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I got a picture of it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, who am I, Moses, and who am I? And that's on the outside, and on the inside, the thing that you see is that I'll be with you.
Right.
Well, I
Right.
can transfer that down
Mhm.
personally.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm in there, if you're so holy, why don't you intervene the way I would like you to, please?
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
so-
right.
So I think that part is, he's holy, and in this story, but as you say, vulnerable.
Right.
So he hasn't
Yeah.
got a list of things that say, okay, I'm gonna make it happen, Sam.
Mhm.
He does not do that.
Right. Yeah,
And
exactly.
so whether that makes it any better for me or not, I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
that phrase is, I think, extremely important.
I agree, and thank you, because that's, if I were to make one more point today that I brought, at least, it would be about what this story teaches us about God's holiness and what the implications of God's holiness are. Looking at chapter 3 again, if you look at your text, verses 1 through 6, is the revelation of the fact that God is holy. We get to verse 6, and that's what we've learned. God is holy. Take your shoes off, right? Verse 7 through 12, you could sum up, but what are the implications of the fact that God is holy? Well, God gives us some, right? In verse 7. After, I am this God, I am holy, we get, then the Lord said, to your point, right on exactly what you were saying, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, etc. Verse 9, the cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And then in verse 12, after who am I, right? I will be with you, and this will be the sign. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will be with me here on this mountain. You will worship me here. In other words, the ultimate, the point we're trying to get to, the destination in verse 12, is holiness joined. I mean, it's an invitation ultimately to being in it with God. You'll be with me on this mountain, this place that is holy. It's not that I'll be here and you'll recognize me as such. It's I'm bringing you to me. And, reading back across everything I just read, the really good news about God's holiness is just the kind of holiness that it is. That God is holy apparently means that God has seen the misery of the people. God has heard their cry. God even knows their suffering. God is in it. God is with them in it and paying attention to it. God is close to the suffering of the people, the mess of this world we started with in class today. God is not distant from it, calling them out of their muck into whatever sacred, clean place God is in. God is literally, I have come down, right? And I'm now going to work for this people in the place that they're in. I mean, God's holiness, the immediate implication in this narrative is that God is vulnerable and exposed to the full breadth of the evil and the suffering and the oppression that that the people of Israel especially, are bound up in. In sum, I mean, this is a picture of the holy God as vulnerable, as exposed, as committed to and bound up with God's people. It's so important to understand that God's holiness doesn't result in distance, but closeness. And we did this in the fall, but Leviticus is actually all about this. And it's often misconstrued as being about something else, like keep far away from me. Really, it's so that God can dwell in the very midst of the people, right? That's the gospel of Leviticus. Like, there's a way for us to be joined together in holiness. So it's that closeness, it's that relationship and vulnerability that we see here in God's holiness in Exodus. Megan, yeah.
Kind of to that point,
Yeah.
as we talked about in the previous class, the whole point of this story is the identity setting. That is the salvation, right?
Mhm.
So this moment, in a lot of ways, is that initial identity setting. You know, Moses asking, "Who am I?"
Yeah.
And God's responding, "I will be with you."
Yeah.
That you are the person who God is with. And if we're saying, you know, that I will be with you, that is what makes God holy. And
Yeah.
that point of God's closeness.
Yeah.
So when we say, "Hallowed be thy name," you're in fact saying, "God will be with me."
Yeah.
That is who I am.
Yeah.
And I identify in that way.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. We're pretty much there. But I mean, thank you. It's a wonderful comment to end up on, and I agree that our petition, I mean, coming all the way back around, is then that, you know, the name, which I think the name, you know, which we didn't talk about the meaning of the name, really for a reason, but the namedness of God, that God has a name. God is a person, you know, opening God's self to relationship with God's people. We want that to be kept holy among us. We want that God's name, the thing that we use to access God, to expose God to ourselves. We preserve that thing about God, and our lives together as a community, like, celebrate that reality of God's character. So when we pray for this to be kept holy, we pray for the community to continue recognizing this aspect of God and living into that part of God's character. We got to take up Moses' attitude, you know, with God and get into relationship with God. Thank you, Megan, for that wonderful concluding remark. And thank y'all for your attention. It's been great to have you today.